let's talk a little about tackle. I'll recommend some, and then, like I said, these are going to be general rules. You can change a lot of things in the general. These are just recommendations that'll give you a good place to start to get cobia tackle. So, and then I'll show you some rigs that I use. The first thing is you want a medium to heavy to a heavy spinning or casting rod. Either or. Medium heavy to heavy spinning, casting, or spinning rod. And the reason I say medium heavy to heavy, if you go out there with a medium and you have a 50-pound cobia, you're going to get spanked. In other words, he's going to get to the marker, the structure, he's going to wrap you around it, and he's going to break you off. You're not going to stop him. So that's why you're going to have at least a medium heavy. More to a heavy side if you're looking for a bigger cobia. A minimum of a 30-pound braid. That's a minimum of a 30-pound braid. And I would go up to a 60-pound braid. So it all depends what kind of cobia I'm targeting. But 30 to 60 is fine, depending on the reel that you have. Something to remember, when you're putting 60-pound braid on, make sure you're not putting it on a reel that's on a 2500. You also have to have a reel that equals the strength of the braid. And the reason for that is you'll break the gears. The reel's not made to have that much pressure on the gears. So if you buy a 2500 reel, no matter which company makes it, you put 60-pound braid on it, and you try to stop a 50-pound cobia by slowing them down, you're going to torque the gears most likely in that. So you have to have a reel that can handle that 30 to 60-pound braid. A leader, a minimum of 33 inches. Why did I come up with that? I came up with 33 inches because the legal limit for a cobia in Florida is 33 inches. So that's the legal limit. You want to have at least 33 inches because they will roll on the line, they'll tail whip the line, and you'll have at least a safety barrier of 33 inches of fluorocarbon. I put more than 33 inches, but 33 inches should be where you start. And when you catch a cobia, the legal limit is from the nose to the fork. So there's a fork in the tail of a cobia, and maybe at the end of the seminar, if we have we had a poster up here with a cobia on it. It's actually over there. I'm going to go over and I'm going to show you the fork of the cobia where you measure. So it's not to the end of the tail at the point, it's the fork where you measure that 33 inches at. So that's very important. 50-pound fluorocarbon leader. 33 inches of 50-pound fluorocarbon leader. If I'm in open water on the flats, I'll go to 40. If I'm around a heavy structure like an oil platform, I might go to 60. But in a general rule, I use 50-pound fluorocarbon. That's what I use. Hook size, 4/0, 4/0 to 7/0, depending on the size of my bait. If the bait's on the bigger side, like I'm using a big mullet or using a larger pinfish, I'll use a 7/0. If I'm using a scale sardine or a smaller threadfin, I'll use a 4/0. Now here's something really interesting. I use J hooks and I use circle hooks. And this is how I distinguish either. If I'm going to hold the rod in my hand, I'll use a J hook. Because I instantaneously can feel the bite. I can reel down the slack. When the rod bends, I can set the hook. If I'm going to do a lot of flatlining, in other words, having the rod sit in a holder while I'm fishing for other species, I'll use a circle hook. The reason is because the circle hook will automatically set in the fish's mouth when the cobia grabs it and turns to go. That hook will just roll right in the corner of his mouth. So I don't have to do anything. So that's why. If I'm holding it, I'll use a J hook. If I'm keeping it as a flat line or in a holder, I'll use a circle hook. You can do the other. You can hold it and use a circle hook, and you can stick it in the holder and use a J hook. But I think your hookup ratio will be better if you do the opposite. These are general suggestions now. For the tackle, many anglers go a lot lighter just for the sport, and some anglers go heavier because they just want to eat the fish and they don't want it to get wrapped around the structure. They just want it in the cooler, and they don't care about fighting the cobia as much. Through my personal experience, I have found many times while fishing on the inshore structures like markers and bridges, and while I'm offshore fishing structures like reefs and wrecks for other species, especially mackerel, in the spring and the fall, cobia will be present even if I don't see them. If I don't see them, I know somewhere they're lurking around. They're mixed in with those species. And I will always keep a flat line out. But while I'm fishing for other species, and this is something really important, and I found this to help and increase my amount of cobia catching during their runs. I cut up live bait like thread fins and scale sardines. I prefer a thread fin to cut up because it's oilier and bloodier, and I prefer the scale sardine on the hook for the cobia to eat because it lives longer. I don't have to change the bait out as frequently. It'll swim around and it'll have more action, and the cobia is more apt to find it that way. I put them out on a flat line, and I'll explain what a flat line is. I'll even use a pinfish. Cobia love pinfish, or a scale sardine. A scale sardine and a pinfish are my two favorite, and I actually would take a scale sardine over a pinfish because I've caught more on a scale sardine than I have. My largest cobia came on a pinfish, but my majority of them come on scale sardines. One of the reasons could be it's because I always have a scale sardine hooked when I'm fishing for the other species. That could be. If I had a pinfish, maybe that always had a pinfish on, it would be the opposite. I would be catching more cobia on pinfish. But either or, pinfish or scale sardine, you can't go wrong with either one of those. And maybe even a crab, which myself, I'm guilty of not using enough crabs. Even though I always take crabs if I find one, I don't use them. I wind up leaving them in my well and forgetting about them. But in the future, I'm going to remind myself, because I'm telling you, also, use the crab. It might even be more effective than any of them. And maybe even catch a bigger cobia. Sometimes I like to balloon the bait, and I'll explain what that is, to keep it higher in the water column, to keep the bait in sight for two reasons. One, so the cobia can see it, because it is a pelagic, roam in the open ocean. And the other thing is I can keep an eye on the balloon. And the reason I use a balloon is because I like to use a bigger bait for cobia. Because 33 inches is a big fish. He'll easily eat a big bait. And a small cork that we use, if the bait pulls it under, then I can't see the cork. I don't know really where the bait's at. But if I use a balloon and I blow it up big enough, I can actually see the bait. I know what it's doing. I know where it's going. And if it goes under, I know it's a big cobia. Because the big circumference, or the big area of the balloon, the water resistance is hard. So if a fish pulls it under, I know it's going to be a good one. Going back to what a flat line is, I'll explain that. A flat line is simply a line, your braided line, a leader, and a hook. Nothing else. You can have the balloon on there, maybe even a split shot if you want to get the bait low in the water column, but just the bait. There's not going to be any heavy lead weights on it. There's not going to be a whole bunch of hooks and there's going to be a single hook on it with a bait just swimming around out there. That's a flat line. And the reason it's a flat line is I am fishing for other species. It's just sitting out there. We call it free line inshore, offshore it's flat line, in a rod holder. If I see a cobia and I can't get his attention and he's about to leave the area, I will sometimes take my rod tip and slap the water. And the reason I'll slap the water is because it makes a commotion. And there are very curious fish. This at times will get their curiosity up and they'll actually turn around and come back and take the bait. Whereas if I didn't do that, I wouldn't catch that fish. And here's why I said that. If he's leaving the area, you have nothing to lose. He's going to go. So you're not going to catch him anyway. So if you slap the water and he turns around and comes back, and then he eats the bait, and you don't know how many times that's worked for me, or do a figure eight or something to make some noise with the surface of the rod. Now I don't throw soda cans on the deck. That's not going to work. I slap the water surface as like a fish feeding frenzy, another fish eating, to excite them. And sometimes that works really, really, really good. So remember that. Their curiosity is very high. He's about to leave. Last resort, you haven't caught him. Slap the surface with the water, with the rod, with your hand, or do something, and that might get the cobia to come back. Something I really do, and I commonly do, is I will blind fish any structure I have ever caught a cobia on in the past. And I do this all the time. I did it last week when I had a couple of tackle manufacturers on my boat. We were traveling, and I see a marker, and I say, I usually stop at that marker, and I tell people, I can guarantee a cobia. Because I've caught cobia a couple of times in the past on the surface after sightseeing them from my tower of my boat. Now I know there's always a lot of cobia there, but they're not always at the top. So, in the past, I caught a cobia at the top, so what I will do is I will anchor up on the marker where I have caught cobia in the past, seeing them at the top, and I will use a live bait on a jig head, or I'll use a jig head with a piece of crab or cut bait. Cobia love cut bait. I don't care what it is, cut ladyfish, cut mullet, on the bottom on a jig head, super effective for cobia. And I can't tell you how many times, without seeing them, I will pull up to a market and tell somebody, there's a good chance we'll catch a cobia here. I'll put a cut bait or a live pinfish or a sardine on a jig head, send it down, and boom, a cobia comes, and I went from zero to the hero. And it happens so many times, and I suggest you do the same. It's going to help. A high percentage of the time, too, I will catch a fish at these structures, and I'll never even see the fish. And I think people don't look at that and stop. They don't see it, they keep going. While fishing, and this happened 2 days ago, Wednesday, while I had the tackle manufacturers on my boat, I was fishing for snook off the beach. I look in the distance and I see two big black, I call them logs. And I'm like, bingo, it's cobia. So I went over there to search, and of course it wasn't. It was a shark. And this is why I bring it up. Cobia look like sharks, and sharks look like cobia. Don't discard at a distance when you see something and say, oh, it's a shark, I'm going to let it go. It could be a cobia. This happened to be a shark, which we happened to hook up, a 6-foot black tip, when we had it on. It was a blast. But I caught it on my cobia rod. I have it all rigged up, which I'll show you the exact rod. I have it here tied exactly the same way we caught the shark. At a long distance, they always look like sharks. Usually when they get closer, you'll be able to tell that it's a cobia. Once caught, a cobia will fight really hard. But once you land it, they exhibit, and especially get it in the boat, they exhibit a crazy, uncontrolled behavior, and it can be very dangerous in the boat. So when you land a cobia and you bring it in the boat, be careful. And people always tell you, make sure you go right to the ice chest, if it's legal. So if a legal fish, if you catch it, you can see it's well over 33 inches, send it right to the cooler, and then close the lid. Because they'll break rods, they'll hit you, they'll cut you open, they'll do all kinds of things. If you don't have if you don't have it under control and the cooler is in the front of the boat, something I always do is wet a towel. Even if it's a not a legal cobia and you want to unhook it and you got it in the boat, you would try to unhook it in the water, but that could be dangerous with cobia, and I'll tell you why. Not only because they exhibit this crazy behavior, they have these spines on top of their head, 7 to 10, 7 to 9. They're sharp like razors and they're pointy and they will cut you. Take a wet towel, put the wet towel over its head and its eyes. This has a tendency to calm the behavior of the cobia down. If you know it's a legal cobia, stick it with a gaff. Now remember this when gaffing. The point of the gaff should always face out towards the boat. The hook should go this way, not in. Not only could you hook your boat, but you're going to hook yourself. The gaff should always go out, and so you don't hook yourself. And I prefer, myself, is a heavy-duty gripper, which I will show you in a minute, which I use for cobia. The gripper I use is rated to 125 pounds, which is just about the world record for a cobia. So, unless I catch one, and the gripper will hold something like 180. So, unless I get one that big, then, I don't even know if I'd want to put a gaff in that thing, because I've put gaff in a cobia before that was big, and they actually could swing enough and take the gaff out of your hand. So another thing, you should also have a float on your gaff. Back to that note, cobia have 7 to 9 spines. It's on their top of their head, just before the dorsal fin. They're very sharp, they're pointy. They're retractable, so you don't always see them. But when they're angry, they'll pop up, or when they're excited, let's say, they'll pop up and they'll open, and they will cut you open very bad in your hand. So you got to make sure that you handle the cobia correctly.